and thank you so much for being here today. I think we are going to get started, and I'm especially grateful for those of you who have left the beautiful day outside, all that wonderful sunshine, to come in and be with us during this teaching in a digital age. But I'm not feeling guilty about it because I know you will find this a very rewarding hour, but we still all thank you. And please do make sure to get one of the flyers about the lectures in the series next quarter. The next one will be on May 13th and will feature Scott Sagan speaking on stimulation and simulations. And I think you will all find that very stimulating. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of Professor Rick. We are so very grateful he was willing to speak today in this series. He received his bachelor's in anthropology from UC Santa Cruz, and then a master's and a PhD, both again in anthropology from the University of Michigan, the last in 1978. He then went very briefly to Western Washington University, and then Washington State University, and then came in the same year, again 1978, to Stanford, where he has made his career ever since, and where, given his dedication to students and alum and to the campus, those of us who know of his career thus far hope he will continue to be for the rest of his career. Professor Rick has written 3 books with another forthcoming and over 30 articles that have focused on a number of areas: Andean pre-ceramic and formative archaeology, South American prehistory, Southwest North American archaeology, stone tool technology, and the archaeology and ethnology of hunter-gatherers. What has particularly marked his research, however, has been his ability to share the results of his work, not just with his fellow specialists, and even not just with undergraduate and graduate students, but with alums and with the broader public. Indeed, some of the insights that he'll share with us today come from his many years of dedicated exploration of how to make archaeology, which traditionally was limited to the very few who could undertake field work, open to those of us who may have it by second-hand experience only, although another significant thing he has done has been to provide opportunities for alums to join in his field work. This is in addition to his exploring how technology can help archaeologists and archaeologists in training discover through technology aspects of their own field that they may not have been able to realize before. Let me add, however, that he knows not only the power but the pain of technology. 2 years ago in the spring, he was slated to give a major presentation in Los Angeles that was to rely heavily on visuals on the computer. At the last minute, his PowerBook was stolen, leaving him without any of the extras that his lecture was going to largely draw upon, and yet he was still able to deliver a smash presentation. In pursuit of his goals, Professor Rick has received many honors, including NSF grants, a visiting fellow appointment at the University of Cambridge, the Alan Cox Medal for Faculty Excellence in Fostering Undergraduate Research, and the Stanford Alumni Association's prestigious Richard W. Lyman Award. We are particularly interested in his teaching, of course, and here he has won 2 of the university's highest honors, the H&S Dean's Award for Teaching in 1981 and the Hoagland Prize for Excellence in Undergraduate Education in 1988. Amazingly, he has also spent the last 4 years chairing his department and 2 years directing Stanford's Archaeology Center. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Rick. Oh, and I have to give him the microphone.
Terrific. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your presence here. The astute among you will notice that my teaching awards came in the pre-digital age, or at least my pre-digital age. So I'm not so sure that what I'm going to talk about today is exactly award-winning, nor is there any guarantee that it's actually going to work. Good, we got that far. Display grammar suggestions. Get that out of there. My God, thank you. What I really want to talk to you today is sort of about my love-hate relationship with digital technology in teaching, and that's very much an outgrowth of digital technology and research. I had a very, very strong infatuation with this lover of digital technology, starting, well, with the microcomputers and coming on up into the 90s. And in the 90s, I started using it in teaching and thought it was a solution, and just everything's so totally wonderful. And as with many of those relationships, as time goes on, you begin to discover the dimensions of the beloved, and you realize that it's not going to be a bed of roses all the way out. More and more, I've come to sort of this position that digital technology is obviously bigger than all of us combined. We don't determine where it goes. We don't determine what programs stay on the market and what don't. The academic community is a tiny one, relatively speaking, and more than that, it's not unified. We aren't a market force. I imagine if you go to Microsoft and say, all the faculty at Stanford want this, they'd go, all right, thank you for your troubles. We'll see you later. They could care less. We're left with a bunch of tools that are largely coming out of a business world. And as I'll argue today, a lot of them I don't like at all. And I think they really handcuff us. But nevertheless, I still do retain the infatuation and think that digital technologies not only are the way we have to go, but that there is a lot of benefit to get from them. Now, as a caveat, I am not the quintessential digital teacher. I shy away from a lot of things. I have my students do all the web stuff. I don't want to get near it. I don't have time for it. And coursework scares me, okay? And it's one of the easiest things that's out there. I just don't have enough time to incorporate everything, as most people don't. But most of my time isn't digitally spent anyways. So in many ways, I'm a novice. I want to make some points along the way about what I think works and doesn't. That's not to say in any sense that I'm recommending what people should do. Maybe there'll be a few things you can take with you from what I say that will be useful. But I want to try in the end to give you a perspective. And you'll notice here I'm using Word, okay? Real simple technology, but I want to give my perspective on how we might make use of digital technology in teaching, which I think by and large we haven't. By and large, I feel like I haven't. In many ways, all we're doing is using digital technology as a surrogate for what we did before, and that surrogate, as I've already mentioned, comes with some real drawbacks. I think we've got to try to get beyond that, and it will be a little bit painful to do so. Which is obviously where I'm going here at the bottom, the costs. Anyone who does this is quite aware of it. If you're coming out of an analog, film, slide, whatever world, and you're converting to digital, that's going to take you a fair amount of learning, time involved in the transfer of resources out of the analog world. Again, the conversion of those slides, you need to buy a slide scanner or have somebody scan them for you. You have to learn what to do with that once you get them. You have to find something to cover the cost of that. You already paid for those slides, right? You already developed them. You probably have got nice filing boxes, etc. Now you're going to have to pay again. So there are costs, and they're very definite costs. Number two is the most important one. It isn't, to my mind, getting from where you were to the equivalent position in digital technology. If that's all there was, it probably wouldn't be worth the pain and some of the drawbacks. But the thing is, what can we do with the new possibilities that are out there? What do those represent? Now today, I'm only going to really be able to address what they represent to an archaeologist. because every field will have its own take on this. But I want to try to at least give you a sense of what I think I can do, and in some cases I've done, that gets well beyond what I could have done before, that really opens those possibilities. And then finally, just to that bugbear, the bottom here, maintenance, there's a lot of cost just keeping going. You know, accept the fact that every 2 to 3 years you have to have a new laptop. You have to. I'm sorry, you know, when you get it 3 years, you will be feeling the pain. If you haven't already, there are a lot of things that you won't be able to do on that computer. That computer is going to have enough things that are being loaded each time you start it up that it's going to start to cough and spit. If you're getting into a 4th year with a laptop and successfully digitally teaching, exploring new possibilities and frontiers, please tell me about it. I don't really think there's such a creature out there. So we're going to have to renew that hardware. There's more money, time researching these pieces of equipment, getting the new ones that don't work, getting them repaired and stabilized into their position. The software is a huge headache that I don't need to tell people about, but in my use of digital, the constant upgrading of QuickTime with backwards incompatibility, radical backwards incompatibility, it blew away 1,000 CDs that I had burnt. Okay? And there's not a darn thing you can do about it. The backwards incompatibility, in many senses, of Internet Explorer, since many things are going to be running in that, in a browser window, these are just huge headaches that will continue to bug you, not to develop, but to maintain what you're doing. Some of the stuff that I'll show you today, I can only run on my laptops because my desktops, which are always plugged into the web, have been automatically upgraded, and those upgrades have eliminated the possibility of using a lot of my teaching software. What a pain. Finally, you've got to back it up. You don't want to put yourself at risk, but I'm sure you've heard that many times over. So there are costs. So why are we doing this then? Benefits. Well, there's this image that we may save time. And as a slide sorter, if any of you have dealt extensively with slides as a teaching resource, in which you primarily have one copy of each slide, but you may use that slide in many different situations. And as your slide collection goes from 200 to 500 to 1,000, I was, at the time I abandoned slides, was pulling on about between 7,000 and 10,000 slides. And the sorting of them for any given lecture would typically take in the range of 2 hours. Refinding, I'm not the most organized person, but I'm not the worst either, and refinding those images, getting them in, and feeling the frustration of the 1 or 2 images that I could not get into that sequence because I couldn't find them. Okay? So there is some time saving that could come about at that point. And I think that we have a potential to gain there quite a bit. Portability, yeah, you can take it with you. The laptop that I have here has, I don't know, somewhere in the range of 30 to 40,000 images that I will draw on. I don't use all of those in my teaching, but I can draw on them because they're all here. More importantly, this laptop has every digital lecture I've ever given, which I don't know. I don't have an easy way to count them because they're not in individual files. But it's probably somewhere in the range of between 500 and 1,000. So I can take it with me. I can burn it onto CDs or DVDs. That is a tremendous possibility, a tremendous potential, not only to avoid loss, but to be able to move around. At one and the same time, let me just say, as one of these little sidelights of advice, if anybody is early on in digital technology, I highly recommend that you be as independent as possible. Do not rely on web connections to give lectures. You'll be fried. Don't even think about it. Do not rely on somebody else's laptop to give your lectures. Chances of your, whatever it is, running on somebody else's laptop is extremely poor. Get a laptop, get to know it, get an idea of how it performs in relationship to the equipment that you use and you might project using. This Dell, for instance, If I take it to Annenberg, I cannot see my screen at the same time that the projector projects up in front. I have no idea why. I'm seeing it right now, but it won't do it. It just simply won't. I've gotten used to the idea that occasionally I'm going to give a lecture where I'm going to have to look up there and not here. So getting to know that equipment, but taking your equipment with you is so tremendously important. And I think for most people, I would seriously recommend that you get your own projector. They're getting so light now and so portable. Yeah, it's money. Absolutely is. But getting that ability to show your own images fail-safe or reasonably fail-safe, I think is tremendously important. Okay, there's all these other things, flexibilities, adaptabilities, and recombination. This is something where I think there's the great danger, so I'll get into next, where digital may fail us. We can constantly modify lectures. We can, just before a lecture, as I was doing at home today, put something new in there. But it's awfully easy not to. Okay. So here's something where we've really got to think about this potential. How can we use this technology where before, man, you had your slides in the carousel, and if you're concerned about inserting a new slide in the middle of 80 other ones, you're going to do the old slide leapfrog if you want to keep the order that you want. At any rate, this sort of thing, including very last-minute flexibility, comes to us with digital. And then really the extension of that, getting into things that you couldn't do before. Yeah, you could insert a new slide into a carousel with some pain before, but there are so many things, as I've already referred to, we can do now that we couldn't do before. But we'll get to those soon enough. Now, the dangers. Okay, failure. This week, on Monday, in my intro archaeology course, for the first time in memory, I'm not quite sure it's the first time ever, this computer failed on me. And it failed ultimately, completely, terminally. It simply would not go more than 3 minutes before it would die, both screens, there and here. And I still don't know why, and it still might happen today. I've done some things since, so I think there's some chances. But how do you avoid that ultimate failure? Well, I'm not sure you can. I really think you have to be prepared for the idea that along with digital technology comes the idea that you may be without your images or whatever is on that computer, and live with it. Okay? There's, Monday, I could do two things. I could try to tinkle with my software, try to do something to get my images back, or I could give the lecture without the images. I chose the latter after a brief interlude of messing around with my computer. But obviously, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that we can do to avoid failure. One is a dedicated laptop for teaching, or pretty close to it. Have something, the last thing I would ever do is take my teaching laptop and have it connected to the web. I think that's probably a pretty good formula for failure. You're going to pull something in there sometime that you don't want. And if you can possibly avoid it, I certainly would. One of the nastiest failures I've ever seen, concrete piece of advice, never ever screw a VGA cable into its sockets. Never ever. If you must, do it at the wall, but never screw it into the back of your computer. Somebody trips on that cable, roughly 300 pounds of test on that line, and if your computer is anything other than locked to where it is, it will go flying. There's no reason ever to screw that VGA cable in my experience. I've never seen one come out on its own. Little tip, okay? All right, so failures are just going to occur. I've polled people on Macs and IBMs, and as far as I can tell, it's really all about the same. Failure in the sense of not being able to do what you want to do is going to occur. And Macs are wonderful for getting proprietary connectors, which I guess have come back in now, I've just been told, to some models. And incompatibilities with projectors and inabilities to run this or that. Yeah, frankly, I don't think the platform makes a whole lot of difference. What makes a lot of difference is how well you know it, how well you're used to using it, and how well that computer does primarily that. Now, fossilization. This is what I think is really the biggest worry, and I've referred to it already. When we get digital resources, they can go onto CDs, and they stay there, and we pull them back, and we project them again in class. Here it is, just like it was last year, and the year before, and the year before, and the year before. At least with slides, you had to resort them, and in the resorting process, you quite often said, I really don't have anything to say about that. It was harder to put stuff in, but it was easy at least to take it out. With digital stuff, it's awfully easy just to leave it just the way it is and never modify it. So I think that this is really one of the big worries that we've got. Elimination of the presenter, another one that I think is abundantly apparent. I'm sure all of you have had a good deal of experience with this guy. The more that your digital resource does for you, at some level, the less you have to do for yourself. Where is the presenter? What's the role? What's the value added by having anybody up here at all? Familiar theme, but I think a significant worry. To what degree are we just consumed by the resources that we put out there? And to what degree are we really driving those resources? And thus far, in this presentation, you get the idea, well, what you've done driving the resources, you've scrolled down in Word in full screen mode with a little bit of color in the background. Not much driving going on here. I hope to show you some of the things that I like to do that bring the presenter back into the picture, that don't allow you to go on autopilot, that say, don't just sit here and stare at your screen. Remember what's going on in the other windows. Okay? Be multidimensional. Okay, so that'll be the solution to that one. I have no solution for exhaustion. It's just something where we can expect that we're going to put more and more time into digital teaching. I don't think in the long run, in fact, it saves me any time, but it sure allows me to do things that are more fun. All right, so let's get into some examples. The end of the word screen. Okay, I'm not going to belabor this first point too much, but I hate PowerPoint with a passion. I think it is one of the greatest evils in the current world. The reason I believe that is, number one, it's a prime example of a fossilizable product. You put together a PowerPoint presentation, and as most of you know, it creates a macro file, one big wumpin file, and if you want to modify it a little bit, unless you want to throw away the earlier version, you got two big wumpin files. You add a few more images, and they get bigger, bigger. And if you've ever tried to export PowerPoint, I mean, take a CD with a really complex digital presentation on it, with good quality images, which quite often people don't use in PowerPoint, and you're getting way up in the megabytes, try to run it off the CD in most situations. It can take 15, 20 minutes to load. You've got to move it to hard disk. There are a lot of things that PowerPoint demands of you. There are certain other things that it leads you to do, like glitzy transitions between images, which I find really offensive. I don't really care how you dissolve from one image to the next. And it doesn't keep me awake if each dissolve is different or randomly selected. I just think that there's nothing really wrong with it, but if that's all you got, you're on the, the weak side of Microsoft, basically, and not really giving me very much to go on. Similarly, backgrounds, crushed velvet backgrounds around a relatively small graphic image, again, doesn't get me very far. I want to see the thing big. Now, I'm coming out of the old slide generation where the bigger the better. I really, of course, you could take a 35 millimeter slide and you could blow it way up. And you could zoom in on it if you needed to, something that, unless your digital images are high res, you can't do so well anymore. But still, I want a full screen version. I don't want a lot of this other stuff. It doesn't appeal to me. That's a business product. Okay? And it may sell stuff in other worlds, but if I can't sell you with what I'm trying to put on the screen rather than what surrounds it, what's the point? So, if you're not going to use PowerPoint, what are you going to use? That is a big problem. I have a program that I use. I'll break out to it. It's called Image Access Pro. It is no longer available. It was so good that, and it did so well with the way it worked, that it was automatically eliminated from the market. What did it do? It's actually an image database, a graphics database. So you can sort and put in all sorts of field names for each image and sort them back and forth. I've never even done that. I use it as mostly a quick and dirty slide projector. Now, what's so important about it? And I think there must be other things out there. I've talked with a number of people on different platforms about what's currently available. And I've actually never found anything quite as functional as this, but this is what it does. It simply takes a bunch of images that are sitting on your hard disk, it indexes them, and when you put together a portfolio as it would have, this one labeled 2004 CTL Teaching Talk Thumbnails, it's pulled out of a group of things, and I intend to show you these images eventually. I just simply drop and drag the thumbnails, and it just simply sends pointers out to where those files are. It never, no lecture that I have in Image Access Pro has anything more than just the directions of where to find the files, so it doesn't duplicate the images. That gets around these mega files that PowerPoint puts together. My lecture files are generally about 200K, something like that. So I can put an infinity, practically, of lectures on this computer without endangering the hard disk space at all. The downside is if I move the images, the pointers don't point to where the images are any longer. And this program, which is from about really 5 years ago, has the ability to search for where the images ought to be. But unless you have unique image names, like for instance, if you're using digital photograph file names, DSCN 3584, and if you shoot as many images as I do, if you send Image Access Pro out looking for that image, it may find a different image with the same name. And believe me, it's lots of fun when your thumbnails, which will not change, don't correspond to the images that they project. So there are downsides to this, beyond a doubt. But what's really great is you can very, very quickly put together a new lecture. For instance, I can make up a new portfolio. I just call it test, text, test, whatever. I can open it. I can go to the talk for today, grab a bunch of images, go back, get to my window, drag those images into, hey, maybe I can, maybe I can't. Let's do it another way. Let's go over here and get a bunch of images. I could select in various ways, drop them and drag them over here. And, you know, I've created a new lecture with a subset of those images. I can, you know, just like in any reasonable slide showing program, I can go in and grab some of these images, move them around, change the sequence, and retain the original lecture without any problem. This is nothing more than a slide projector in the way that I'm using it. So there's nothing really innovative. This is the time-saving, but you know, you haven't really done anything with the technology yet thing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's good if it saves you time and it works well. This program has proved amazingly bulletproof, and I just lament the fact that it isn't supported. I'd love to hear from people if they know of other indexing slide projection programs of this sort that allow you to use the same images over and over again without you know, adding little files or appendices onto the images themselves. I'm sure there's other stuff out there. At any rate, there's something that gets us, you know, where we were before. But it's like I put here, Tales of an Old Planet. Now, these other things, doing something new in teaching. Now, what can we do in teaching that allows us to get somewhere we were not before? Well, a lot of it's very simple. To go back to my image access, bring it up now as a slideshow instead. It's a little bit clunky, but it's not too bad. One of the things we can do is play around with sequencing in the way that slides were not so good at. They could do it, but just barely. So in this case, an excavation, I can go in and look at different layers, very quickly made up. Not quite as quick as, hey, let's try that again. There's always object lessons going on, right? Let's start from the top rather than the middle. Let's start from the top this way. One of the disadvantages, or one of the limitations that I'm starting to show you as an object lesson, what happens when your laptop gets overloaded. Now, maybe I could just pause to take a moment and mention why that would happen. With PowerPoint, you have the wonderful advantage that you've got one program running, and it's like basically a train going down a track. If you switch PowerPoint from one track to the next, you'll probably continue on that track all the way out. Now, you could run two versions of PowerPoint side by side, I think. Not 100% sure it works, but because I don't use it. But you could run two sequences of PowerPoint. But the important thing to me is that I can do this multiple sequencing. I can have a lot of things going on in the computer simply by windowing around. And it's not very elegant. But if you're fairly fast moving, and if you know where your images are, you can get there pretty quickly, and you can have a lot of different things going on. Obviously, you could have a map that you just flip back and forth to. I'm sure most of you have probably done stuff like this, so it's not that new. But windowing, using multiple dimensions while you're presenting, is really important to me, because that's where your engagement with the computer comes. If you're thinking, which of the programs comes next? What's the sequence of stuff that I'm doing? You're engaged. You can't check out. You can't leave it behind. You can't just say, next, next, next. You have to know what's there. So in many ways, it may not be that important for the receiver that you're doing that. Maybe in PowerPoint, you could put it all in there, and you'd never have to flip back and forth between a window. But I think for the presenter, it's pretty darn important. It keeps you on the ball. But of course, it also taxes the resources of your computer. But frankly, with most of what we use in presentations, it's not really that bad. But at any rate, back to the image access sequence here. Now I can put images in a sequence which gives us a sense of the progression, for instance, of an excavation. Even though I don't know why it's doing that. That's very irritating. Something going on here. Let's go back out and see if we can diagnose the situation in image access. Why are you skipping? Oh, look at that. Interesting. It's not skipping. It's doing exactly what it was told to do, but in some amazing fashion, this group of images got out of order. Ah, thank you. Okay, good. Well, at any rate, this should take care of it. Again, you could probably do that in PowerPoint that easily. Probably wouldn't screw up PowerPoint that easily, but at any rate. So we can go through the sequence and see this excavation, in this case actually going right on down to the bottom. And definitely are taxing the resources of the computer because we're getting the hourglass. All right, but be that as it is, I think maybe what we're going to do is go to one of the programs that's causing the trouble and use its graphic so that we can get out of it. Let's stay with this. Ooh-wee. A lot of things got out of order here. I'm going to start here instead. Okay, here's another example of something you can do that digitally you can do. It looks like we're a little bit on the, I don't know if you can see that very well. I wonder, is there a possibility of dropping lights in here at all? Or is that? Good. Excellent. Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay. For instance, we can take these potsherds from my favorite site in the Peruvian Andes. What which are a pretty scrappy lot. They're in lousy shape. Paint's peeled off of them. The surface slip is largely gone. And you can start to put them back together and just clone, of course, the colors from the remnant areas right out and over the degraded surfaces. So in a classroom setting, you can show people what the stuff looked like, but also the transition intermediate points between the real thing and what you think was actually there in the past. This, together with that previous group of images that I put together, give you a sense of time sequence. You can play with time sequences digitally, not merely as video. In other words, a progression without any control over the speed, where you could stop and start maybe, but basically it's going to go from A to B and directly there. Here you can play around with, partial sequences with a control at the computer that you really haven't had with other media. So I think that's tremendously important. Too many of these. You can obviously also play around with realities. Photoshop, photo paint is tremendously useful in putting together quickly things that will tell you about something. This is a landscape in the Andes where we work, and it's a fictive landscape. You may notice the repetition of structures. There are a lot of identical houses there because I've cloned them around and about, giving an image of one interpretation we had of a prehistoric landscape and its population density, and then a quite different one, which is actually what last summer's research produced. Total revision of the way we believe people were living on that landscape. You want to teach that in a class, you can say to a class, well, we think we're going from a moderate density of housing over to a really intense use of a part of that landscape. And an image like this, visualization, I think gets that message across a lot better. Similarly, in this same place, looking at the same plot of land from a different angle, but of course out of order, here's what that same piece of land looked like looking across an archaeological site, across a river, to a landscape that now has been very heavily impacted by having a road cut through it. And within a few years of any road being cut through any place in the Andes, you expect a squatter settlement. So with a little bit of work in Photoshop, there's the squatter settlement. That's how it's going to look within 5 years. Again, if you think back to pre-digital days, how would you do that? You could take photographs and cut them out and paste them and re-photograph. I mean, you put in 2 or 3 solid days of work to make up this image rather than probably about 20 or 30 minutes, which it took me. So you can do a lot of things pretty quickly. Another really silly little thing is this that I just, for some reason, decided to put together this morning. Your Monty Python talking Leland image. But, that's incredibly fast. I measured the time on this. It took me 7 minutes to do this. And it's about worth 7 minutes, too. But if it had more of a point to it, it might be of some value. At any rate, there's just so many things you can do with these visualizations. And it can go beyond that. Here, let me show you another visualization. In this case, the archaeological site I work in, within a CAD model, a fly-through. And if you think about what you can learn from this, I mean, even if I didn't say a word about it, and actually haven't yet, you pretty quickly get the idea that there's a space that's of interest, and there's objects on the floor of the space, and that space is entered through a vertical shaft. You get a lot of information into something like this real fast. Now, that could have been done before with video. It could have been put on a videotape. And this is a fly-through, so I can stop it, but I can't control the speed of it. Well, I can, but not real time. And I can't three-dimensionally navigate around the model. That's not a possibility with the power of the computer and the particular model that I've got. But clearly, in the range of visualization, that's kind of fun. That was the thing that was eating our memory, too. The thing I want to hint at here and I really won't have time to develop it, in part because I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, even within archaeology, is that in research, if we look at archaeological research, the important thing isn't visualization. The important thing is that we can work with 3 dimensions. In fact, as some of colleagues here in civil engineering are doing, 4 dimensions. You can do 3 dimensions through time with real control over that on the computer. When I first started using CAD, computer-aided design, I said, this is what the computer is for. This is the first time I have done something that I couldn't do with a lot of work using other means. Statistics? Get out the calculators, you can do factor analysis, you can do multidimensional scaling. It's going to take you a long time, but you can do it. But you can't do CAD, 3-dimensional CAD, and the types of analysis that are possible within it. And I don't think we want to try to go too far with this because it's clunky at best still in most implementations that I use. But I can play around with 3 dimensions. I can move through a site. I can play with those 3 dimensions in ways that are very important. Now, that's research. But in teaching, I think there are 2 really important points. I'll make the first one now. Can we bring that live 3-dimensionality not just in terms of visualization, but in terms of understanding how to work on a site, how to come to a realization? The computer opens that door, and I personally haven't stepped very far through it yet. But I think that's important. We're going to be dependent on some pretty high-power tools that may be not tuned to our particular needs. And archaeology is particularly amenable to 3 dimensions, and particularly amenable to the dimension of time. So my flashing realization of the potential of the computer in research, and as I think it should be into teaching, may not be appropriate for a lot of fields. But I bet you there's something equivalent where you can show how you think on the computer rather than just show on the computer. That's, I think, a real frontier and where we really need to push stuff, because it's going to be exciting for those that hear about it. Students sitting there and going, I see what you're saying, and I see why you're saying it. I see the evidence. I see the argument. I see the demonstration, the methodology. Computers can do that because that's, after all, what a good number of us are using in the first place anyways. Keep in mind, in the old mode, nobody ever analyzed a data set with a slide projector that I'm aware of, okay? It didn't get you there. That had to be done somewhere else. But we're using the same instrument in teaching and in research. Why can't we manage to get more of that actual process of research into the teaching situation? Some of you may well be doing this abundantly. I'm still straining to get there. At any rate, let's dump this program and get back to a slightly more agile computer. Now, that's a high-end goal. An intermediate goal might be something more like playing around with 3 dimensions in a simpler way, taking people there in the same sense as that fly-through, but with more ability to manipulate the space. More ability to say, I want to go here now, not accept where the fly-through was programmed to go hours, weeks, or years before. So one of the things that I've spent a lot of time doing is panoramic virtual reality. Some people would call it QuickTime, but that's, of course, just one of the versions of it. But it's basically using a sequence of photographs shot in a panorama, stitched together, and then the panoramas linked together. Here, for instance, for the American Southwest, I did an alumni trip in about 2000, I think, and took along my digital camera and shot a bunch of panoramas very, very fast. I was lecturing. I didn't have time to do a lot of shots. And got a series of panoramas, which this map can take us to. Just simply link from this map down to the panoramas. Here we've flown into a trading post, a very classy trading post. And you can look around. You can zoom in and out. Again, I'm sure most of you have run into this on the web someplace. But can give a tremendous sense of space and relationship between things. It's very quick and dirty. The technology for doing this is very, very easy. Stitching programs are easily found. You don't have to program HTML. This is running in a browser. It's running in Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer, however, has not been kind to this particular program because it has outlawed its plugins. But there are other options. This is one of those higher maintenance things. You start to push out there a little bit further into the not so commonly used territory, and it gets more difficult. Another example is the archaeological site that I work in, lying right here. To give that same sense of panorama, the contextualizing of that, short of using video, which would of course be out of my control, would have been a lot more expensive. You can move around between the panoramas with some minor pixelation problems there, and now be in the site and play around with that. So this is one of the techniques that I find particularly useful in teaching because it's pretty quick to put together. It has quite a bit of effect on the viewer. With the right work, you can start to get really weird effects, and you can make people seasick. It's really fun. But at any rate, so this is one of those things that I like. Now, I just want to mention one more thing before I finish up with one last item. And that is that I've talked about going from visualization to analysis, bringing that analysis or methodology into the classroom through the computer. But one of the things that I think is tremendously important, certainly for archaeology, is to teach that. So if we go back out here, teaching that something new, academic reproduction. Well, before with the slide projector, most people had been subjected to slide projectors at home, okay? Your parents had shown you slides, or some of your parents' friends had shown you slides. You had a sense of this piece of equipment, how to use it. You take a picture, after all, you get the slides back, you put them in the carousel, and you punch the button. But if we're really going to use these sorts of teaching resources, moving out of visualization, and even some of the high-end visualization, into a classroom setting in which these resources are used, we can't really expect our undergrads and grads to learn the ability to teach with those methods by osmosis. Now, some of them are better than us at a lot of things with computers. That goes without saying. But not all of it, and not in the teaching context. I think that it's going to be tremendously important to teach the teaching, to teach that methodology, to get students to the point where they're really proficient users. For graduate students, I think getting beyond PowerPoint and really getting into using the computer, guiding the computer during a presentation, flipping back and forth between stuff. How do you rehearse PowerPoint, right? Just punch the button. And you have to know what to say for the images. Try rehearsing a presentation where you're using 7 or 8 different programs. You need to know, as you're toggling, what comes up on the toggle. You get your act together. You put your ducks in order, literally, in terms of the icons on your screen. So, anyway, I think teaching is important. Teaching of the methodologies for teaching. And it's more important with digital than it has been in the past. Let me leave you with one last thing. When I was teaching an Andean class, actually quite some years ago, Andean archaeology, I had a student who came up and said, I want to do a different type of project. And I wrinkled my brow because this guy seemed like he was a real goof-off in class. I was expecting I was going to get some real bill of goods on this one. And he said, I'm a rapper. I said, yeah. And I want to do a rap song about your site. Well, I had just finished producing a CD of these virtual reality linked images of the site. And he said, you know, I'm really inspired by your CD. And I thought, yeah, sure. And I want to use it to write a rap song. It didn't make any particular sense to me at that point. But I kind of nodded and went on to the next thing. And at the end of the class, this person came in And his final project was a cassette tape. And I just was sharpening up my knife. I thought, wow, I don't, really stick it to students very often, but this is a real opportunity. And the TA who I handed it to came back in about a half an hour later and he said, I think you better listen to this. And I said, okay. So I did, and I was blown away because the student had used the digital resource that I brought into class, used it to orient what I thought was actually fairly creative, if a little bit foul-mouthed, production. So I'm going to play you the latter part of that rap song, and I'm going to try to guide you through the CD as he might have been doing at the time that he wrote the song, except that the song goes too fast, so I'm going to lag behind. But forgive me for that. At any rate, I think we'll be where we're supposed to be.
The whole cult was there. I looked around and everybody looked mad weird. Blood and mucus was dripping off my chin. Still I broke out into the craziest grin. I was in the plaza, but yo, did that just appear? A black and white portal on the lowermost stair. I was drawn up the finely carved granite steps. I heard a voice say it was my final test, and I was back in the tunnels with a torch in my hand. I looked on the wall and saw the head of a man. I lost my way, it was more like a maze. 10 heads on the wall seemed to go on for days, and the faces changed, they became like a beast. That's when I realized they looked just like me. And then, all of a sudden, what the fuck was that sound? A roar, rising from the very temple ground. I ran through the halls, then I dropped like a stone right in front of my face. I saw the land zone. Everything I learned is God personified. Snaky hair, claws, fangs, and some fucked up eyes. Light poured from him. It filled up the room, and he spoke secret words that I'll carry to the tomb. I fell to the ground. It was more than I could take. It made my head spin. It made my knees shake. His nasty grimace was burned in my brain. So much darkness, and he stood like a flame illuminating my path in the darkened maze. I thought I was lost forever, but the guard came to save me. Through a narrow gate, then the tunnel grew wide. I took a right turn. I was almost outside, and I ran from the temple down to the main landing. There in the plaza, the whole cult standing. Then I saw something made my heart beat still. It was the winter solstice, sun rising over the pointed hill.
Okay. At any rate, you get a sense then that here was a student who was otherwise, I can tell you, not very engaged with the class. The digital resource allowed that person to go to a place that I was probably not getting him otherwise, and to apply some creativity, create his own product, which, as I say, totally blows me away. There's a lot of nuances in there you don't get. When he talks about the roaring sound right overhead in that same building, we know that there is a canal carrying water which is used to generate noise within that gallery. We know that drugs are being used to affect the initiates into this cult, and they're confronted by these images with light struck coming in through ventilation shafts. At any rate, he, in this 7 or 8 minute rap song, managed to incorporate an amazing number of elements of what I was trying to get across in the class. I'd argue that without the digital resource, it never would have happened. Well, I think that's about enough. I thank you for your attention. I hope I've offered you something that you didn't know before, and I'm sure I've got a lot to learn from other people. Thanks a lot. Do we do questions? Yeah, I'm happy to do questions. If people need to leave, please take off. It's not a, I know that lunch hours come to an end with a crashing close. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Any comparative experiences? Yeah. I actually have never run into anything. To be honest, I haven't looked very much. But there if anyone knows of such a thing, it would be great to hear about. And it would be ideal to put it together. You know, some of the VR, for instance, there are all sorts of websites that talk about how to do that. Very few that I've ever seen that ever talk about what to do once you've got it. How to integrate it, how to run it in Windows effectively, how to run it full screen. For instance, there are all sorts of problems with this. Unless this computer, which is a very high resolution screen, is artificially downsized in its screen, it'll blow up the minute it hits this. So there are sequences of ways you have to put the stuff together to make it run, that there are all sorts of tips that would be really helpful. But I actually haven't run into resources in that way. Yeah?
I was wondering why you were so concerned about fossilization. Isn't that the way our civilization accumulates fossils?
Yeah, really. I just don't want to become one of them any faster than I have to. Here's where that comes from. I think in my first or second year at Stanford teaching, one student came into office hours and said, you know, it's really refreshing the way you teach. And I go, yeah? He says, yeah, your notes are pretty fresh. I said, what? He says, yeah, your paper isn't all dog-eared and ragged the way the notes, the lecture notes of my other professors are. I thought, wow, this person's really perceptive, you know. And they're judging the faculty member, of course, not by the content of the course, which may be very difficult for them, especially in an intro course, to know whether the professor's updated or not. But the fact that the lecture notes are ragged suggested to them that their faculty are out of date. And so that's where my fear of fossilization had its origins. You know, that students will perceive, and that they will be right, that they're not getting something that's reasonably updated when it could have been. And if digital resources are going to contribute to our fossilization, our remaining static and not unchanging in the way that the way that we teach, and also particularly the content of what we teach, I think it's a big worry. But otherwise, I like other things fossilizing. It's great. Michelle.
You talked about 3D and about visualization and how powerful it can be. I just wondered whether there's ever been sort of a standoff between dual ways of interpreting, say, an archaeological site, where sometimes there are big disagreements about the role of certain buildings or of plazas. If both sides sort of step by step tried to play out in 3D their vision of that site, whether at some point as they each try to do that, that one theory might begin to seem more possible than another.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. 3D in archaeology has tremendous potential in that way. It puts us back on that interface between research and teaching. It's not that many times that you probably will actually resolve the problem for the first time in the classroom, but you could show how it was resolved. For instance, one of the things I have done in the circular plaza from which this sequence started, this structure here, there was a hypothesis by one of my close Peruvian colleagues that there was originally a pillar that stood, a carved pillar that we know today from another, it's in a museum. He believed that that pillar would have thrown shadows in an arc as the sun rose throughout the year, which would have hit an arc of carved stones right across the circular plaza down here. And so in my 3D model, which I'd go back to, but it's safely put to bed at this point, and it takes a while to bring up, I sat down with him and said, Lucio, look, I'm going to bring the sun up right across the year for you. And in rapid fire sequence, I think I said it for every 10 days. And I brought up the sun every 10 days, showed it, I think, about 7:50 in the morning when it was optimally casting shadows, and showed him that there was no way that that shadow would go across that arc. And it would go across part of it, but it couldn't explain why we had a given arc of carved stone. So in the classroom, I have gone back and recreated that debate with him, because it's a very reasonable hypothesis that he had, but until you have the ability to recreate the reality, which these models will do. I mean, I can bring up the sun on any day of the year over the last 10,000 years and show what would have really would have looked like at any given condition of reconstruction of the site in the model. So yeah, I think the potential here is tremendous for demonstrating both in the research debate and in the classroom setting. I think it's great stuff. Yeah, Jane.
As a representative of a central technology supporter, I'd like to know what kinds of support you've gotten centrally have been helpful, and what other kinds of support you would like to have.
Okay. That's the issue of support is a really big one. Support in teaching, we are very lucky in our department to have Claudia Engels, who's our technology specialist. Claudia is the ideal thing. You know, you have in the department someone who can advise you, who can do research for you. When I came to teaching these methods last spring in a course on images and models in archaeological computing, we used Wallenberg Hall and some of the wonderful new teaching resources there, which were very useful, but without somebody to write the proposal for the class to use that space, see that all the way through, make a lot of the arrangements, help load the software, get the servers working, try to teach me how to use that technology, you know, multiple servers and multiple laptops. It gets quite complex. Without that, it wouldn't have been possible to do it all. So what I would say is the primary support is tremendously important on the hardware front, advising on what's good, software as well, what's available, what's not too expensive. And in Claudia's case, what software manufacturers could be approached when you're going to do a class and they'll say, sure, here's 20 copies of a $5,000 program. You know, that's a pretty successful thing. It doesn't always happen. But for faculty to go out and beat the bushes to try to get this sort of resources, pretty tough. So I think that's tremendously important. Then helping to arrange the teaching resources. You know, as you get further and further out on this technology, especially the teaching of it, not so much the doing of it. I don't think faculty should expect other people to get their technological ducks in order when they go into the classroom. If you can't do it there, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Help with it, yeah, but not, you know, coaching you right on through giving the lecture. But when you're trying to teach it, that's when I think it really gets critical. Because unless you're really in a technology field itself, as opposed to a field using technology, you're going to be right at your limit. To really get students beyond your limit, which is where they need to go if they're going to be successful in this radically revising world of technology, I just think that interface is tremendously important. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you in a technology classroom in the future.